In We Slip Up, Laurel and Hardy starred as henpecked husbands making an elaborate withdrawal from their suspicious wives. The boys have just explained that they're merely going to the picture show, and of course the wives believe their every word.
Hello, and welcome to the Laurel and Hardy Blogcast. I'm Patrick Vasey, the author of the Laurel and Hardy blog, the forthcoming book, Laurel and Hardy Silence, and your host for the next couple of hours or so. Today's show is episode 25, and our focus turns to the next film Laurel and Hardy made at the Hal Roach Studios, the 1928 short, Faw Down. To help me to discuss this film and to put it into a little context, I've enlisted the help of returning guest from episode 4 from his home in Toronto, Canada, Chris Seguin. Now, you may recall in episode 4, Chris and I discussed Harry Langdon and his influence on Stan and Babe's comedy. On this show, we take a look at the comedian Larry Semon. Both Stan and Babe worked as supporting players to Larry Semon independently, and interestingly, his star was fading just as Laurel and Hardy's star was entering the stratosphere. It was a really enjoyable and interesting conversation, and I always learn a lot about classic comedy by talking to Chris. As I'm sure you already know, Chris is a film historian and silent comedy aficionado, and among his many contributions to recent Blu-ray and DVD releases, his latest is an audio commentary track as part of the special features on the upcoming Blu-ray release of Buster Keaton's The Saphead. And my copy is already on pre-order for that one, so looking forward to it. Now, before we dive in, I just want to share a couple more reviews that I've received in the past few weeks. The first comes from Any Old Port Sean, who gave the podcast 5 stars, and his review says, "Finally! I have long felt that classic comedy and Laurel and Hardy in particular have been underrepresented in podcasts. The Laurel and Hardy Blogcast rectifies that problem. A cynic may say, who would want to listen to a 2.5-hour podcast about a 20-minute short film? The answer is me. Keep up the good work. I am prepared to go down the rabbit hole." Thanks for that, Any Old Port Sean. That really did make me smile. And the second one is from Unisphere64, and he or she also awarded us 5 stars, and their review reads, "Excellent education. As a lifelong Laurel and Hardy fan, I was overjoyed to recently discover this podcast. Always fascinating information and interviews makes for addictive listening and consistently mind-blowing production information behind our favourite comedies. Keep up the good work." I intend to, Unisphere. I intend to. So thank you very much for those. And if you can, leave a review and a star rating on Apple Podcasts particularly. If not, Podbay or anywhere that you're able to, I really do appreciate it. Now, I've got a quick update for you on the Laurel and Hardy Silence book. Things are coming on apace, and Russell Babbage, who is working on the book with me, Russell and I attended an event, a Laurel Hardy event at the Bull Inn in Bottisford, at the end of July, where we presented a sneak peek of a few of the chapters that have been completed so far. What we've done is we've mocked up a book at sort of the actual size, and we included about 4 chapters. There was Duck Soup, Early to Bed, Should Married Men Go Home, and Bacon Grabbers. Duck Soup included the 10 rare stills that Randy Scretvet has kindly contributed. There was around 50 stills from Should Married Men Go Home, and every still from Bacon Grabbers. So there's some pretty rare stuff on display in there. And this was the first time that we've actually showed any parts of the book project in public, and it was very, very well received. I was absolutely chuffed to bits. Lots of great feedback from the assembled Laurel and Hardy fans, and lots of questions asking, when is it going to be published and all that kind of thing. In terms of when it's going to be published, we were hoping that it would be sometime this year, 2022. If it is, it's going to be at the back end of that year, so likely to be December. But more than likely, it's probably going to eke into spring 2023, I think. I will, of course, keep you posted on when it's going to be published and how you can get hold of a copy as we go along. So watch this space. If you don't want to miss out on any information about the book, the best thing to do is to sign up to my free newsletter. And you can do that. You can find a way to put your name down for that on blogheads.com. That's blog-heads.com. And one final piece of news concerns the Laurel and Hardy Magazine. Now, for about 40 years, I think it is, 40 years or so, Rob Lewis of the Helpmates UK tent of the Sons of the Desert has produced a wonderful quarterly magazine devoted to the boys, with subscribers all over the world. Sadly, Rob has decided to step down and will no longer be producing the magazine, much to everyone's disappointment. But do not despair, as all is not lost. My Laurel and Hardy partner in crime, the aforementioned Russell Babbage, has stepped into the breach and is keeping the publication going. Russ is giving the magazine a new facelift and is creating a really beautiful publication. And what's more, I'm thrilled to say that he's asked me to be the magazine's new editor. This is such an honour for me, as I've been a subscriber of the Laurel and Hardy magazine since childhood, and it's been a part of my life for many, many years. What we're also really thrilled and excited about also is that many of the special guests that we have on the Blogcast have also agreed to be regular contributors to the magazine. So you can expect to see regular articles from the likes of Randy Skretvet and Richard W. Ban, amongst others. And I'll even be putting in an article or two myself every now and then. So if you haven't already subscribed to the new Laurel and Hardy magazine, you can do so by visiting what? Hang on. It's www.laurelandhardymag.com. Laurel, A-N-D, hardymag.com. Or, obviously, you can click on the link in the show notes or in blogheads.com as well. And so I must say a huge thank you to Rob Lewis and also to the former editor Howard Parker and everybody that has been a part of and contributed to the Laurel and Hardy magazine over the years. It has been absolutely much appreciated by me and all of the readers and Laurel and Hardy fans around the world. And we really do hope to continue that legacy and do you all proud. So please do subscribe and support the magazine. The very first issue of the magazine is due out, I think it's the end of August. So get your subscription in as soon as possible. So that's it. You're all caught up. Don't forget, for more updates, do join the free email list on blogheads.com. But for now, on with the show. And this time, we're going to jump straight into the conversation with today's special guest. The audio blog will be coming up a little later in the programme. But otherwise, yeah, let's get into it. I hope you enjoy it. Our guest today last joined us way back on episode 4, almost exactly 2 years ago to the day that we are recording this. Chris Seguin is a blogger and a self-confessed classic comedy obsessive. He has provided a video essay on the BFI's wonderful Blu-ray release of Atoll K, also an essay on Buster Keaton's The Railrodder for a recent Blu-ray release of 3 of Keaton's classic features, and more recently he's also had an extensive essay about Harry Langdon, Laurel and Hardy and Hal Roach in the second edition of the brilliant Komiki magazine. So it is with great pleasure that I welcome back to the Laurel and Hardy Blogcast, Chris Seguin.
Hey, Patrick, I'm happy to be back.
It's lovely to have you back, Chris. And I have to say, I've been really looking forward to catching up with you again because I really enjoyed our first chat. I mean, obviously, we'd never met before, but I really enjoyed that time we spent together looking at With Love and Hisses. And, what was the other one we did?
I think it was Sailor Beware.
Yeah, or Why Girls Love Sailors, something like that. Yeah, so it was long.
Sailors, yes.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so it was a long time ago, and we've moved on a pace on the Blogcast, and we're now talking about films that we would really want to talk about a bit more now. So we have reached 1928's We Faw Down. So, Chris, what have you been doing with yourself in all of this time, barring COVID, of course?
Mostly I've been COVIDing. I can't believe it's been 2 years since the last time we did this. It's just a real indication of how time flies. I've just kind of been keeping busy. I've been absorbing a lot of stuff, really enjoying a lot of the new releases that have been coming out on DVD and Blu-ray. You had mentioned the Buster Keaton one, and there was a recent North American release of Buster Keaton, Rides Again, and The Railrodder, which were the 2 films that he did for the National Film Board of Canada back in the 60s. One is the actual Railrodder of the film, and the other one is the making of documentary. And we were able to get a really great recording of the director, Gerald Potterton, and a cinematographer on the film, Dave DeVolpe, to do commentary tracks for both. So it's great to have these two guys who, lived and worked with Buster Keaton for, I think about 6 weeks shooting the film they shot it on a train. And so it was very close quarters, and it would really get them, and they're just fascinating commentary. So if people in I'm going to promote them a little bit. If people in North America want to look for it, it's called Buster Keaton Rides Again. It's on Blu-ray through Canadian International Pictures. Google it. And it's also on the Eureka Volume 3 release of features that they put out in the UK. So if you're looking for that in the UK, it's really fascinating stuff because Jerry tells, I know he's told me the story, Jerry Potterton. I don't know if he says it on the documentary, but he talks about going to visit Stan Laurel with Buster after the film was made. So this would have been probably late 1964, so just before Stan passed away. And so he went down to visit Buster, and they drove to a hardware store and poked around, and then Buster goes, "Hey, you want to go see Stan Laurel?" And Jerry was a huge fan of Stan Laurel, and was like, "Of course." So he got to spend the afternoon sitting with Buster Keaton and Stan Laurel,
Wow.
drinking a 7-Up, and it's just like, could you imagine being a fly on the wall for that?
That is amazing, isn't it?
It really leads to an interesting thing, which is apparently, I've read that Stan would record conversations with people, and then they wouldn't know it. They'd be these, Stan would just run his tape recorder while they were talking in his place, and then he'd give them the recording or something. But I don't think any of those have ever shown up.
No, that would be a hell of a conversation, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but there are phone recordings, that people, would record Stan when they called him up, and those have been released. Yeah. But could you imagine just these recordings of, Stan and Buster Keaton and this, wide-eyed young British director just talking about whatever? Would have been fantastic.
Yeah, fabulous. Who knows? It may turn up at some point. I wanted to ask you actually, Chris, as well. I mentioned just briefly in your introduction about the Kamiki magazine, which can you just talk a little bit about that? Because I don't know if all the listeners have actually come across this yet. It's a fantastic magazine, and your article, when I said it's extensive, it's about 20 pages of just wonderful stuff about Harry, Hal Roach, and Stan and Babe. And some fantastic images. Can you just talk a little bit about the magazine itself, just for anybody who's not aware of it, and also how you came about writing the article?
Okay, it's probably going to leave out some names by mistake. So I apologize to anyone who's been involved with Kamiki, and I don't mention them, but it's pretty much spearheaded by Paul Garucki, who is an amazing cinephile, collector, etc. He's put out several Blu-ray and DVD collections. He did the Forgotten Films of Roscoe, Fatty Arbuckle. He put out a massive Blu-ray collection of 50 Max Sennett films, shorts and features. He did he worked on and released a restoration of one of Arbuckle's really unseen features called The Roundup, which was Arbuckle's first feature, and it looks gorgeous. It's on Blu-ray. He's in the midst of a Three Stooges project right now. He had done a documentary on the Three Stooges many years ago, so he's got a new project. And so really one of the most well-versed and nicest guys I've ever encountered in this community of I call them film geeks with affection, but with this community. So during lockdown, he really just spearheaded this magazine called Kamiki, which was Arbuckle's studio's name. So that's where he got the name from, Comique, if you're going to Google it. And he just got everyone he could think of to contribute material to it. And to call it a magazine, I think is kind of unfair, because even though he calls it, I think the first one was about 160 pages, and this one's about 240. They're massive things. They're available as PDF for free. Google it and you'll find it. I think it's on archive.org. And it's fascinating reading, because he really does kind of get the best of the best thinkers, authors, essayists on these things involved, and he's done amazing things. He did an amazing thing in, I think, the first issue, where it was a reprint of the Hardy family script. That was the film that Babe was supposed to make after Bonnie Scotland, when Laurel and Hardy were supposed to have come to an end with Patsy Kelly and Spanky as his son. And you read the script and you go, boy, I wish that would have been made. And what's interesting about the script is that it actually morphed a little bit into Charlie Chase's Neighborhood House, which was Charlie Chase's aborted feature film. But when I was reading Randy's new book on the scripts, the Laurel and Hardy scripts, there's a script called Tickets for Two that involves a lot of antics in a parking lot, and that appears in the Hardy family script. So it's like there's never an idea that's ever tossed away at Howard Studios, right? But it's a massive immersive experience to read both of the Komiki magazines. Go get them. As for my involvement, Paul asked me if I could contribute something. I was a little swamped at the time, but I had written an essay a long time ago on Harry Langdon for a Dutch magazine called Blotto, and it was published by a fellow named Bram Reinhout, who's since passed away, and he was the king of the Sons of the Desert in the Netherlands. And that really came about. We talked about Harry Langdon last time we were here. Just a fascination with the actor, and the fact that a lot of his stuff suddenly came out on DVD. So David Cowlett had put out this amazing set of all his shorts. The features became available, and as you started watching them, you just went. And I always felt that Stan was influenced a lot by Harry Langdon, but as you start watching the films, you start to see how much, and then you can make those real connections to, here's Stan doing this and here's Stan doing that, right? And also, Langdon's story is just one of those interesting stories, and I think we're going to touch on someone similar to that later on, where he reached for the stars and tumbled, and ultimately ended up working with Stan and Babe. And it's interesting, at the time he was working with Stan and Babe, especially as 39 came around, where Stan wanted to go off on his own. You kind of were wondering if Harry was going, Stan, you might want to be careful about that, because Harry had his own problems, right? Where he went, I'm going to self-produce. Who needs this? And then tumbled from there. And if Stan only knew what was around the block, if people like Harry or the aforementioned Buster Keaton had gone, probably not so much. Who knows?
You're pretty good where you are.
Right? Yeah, exactly. But the Langdon piece was just one of those nice pieces where you could just totally immerse yourself in the films and really study them, which I would recommend anyone do. Because Harry Langdon is a very, love him or you don't kind of person. I personally love him. I can see why maybe people don't, but I think if people take the time to appreciate him a little bit better, they can get a lot of it. So any chance anyone has to see Harry Langdon, go out and do it. Start with The Strong Man, his feature, or Saturday Afternoon, which is, to me, is strong short.
Yeah, that's one thing I really got out of our last conversation together. Actually, because we were talking about Harry Langdon, it was a bit of an education chatting with you about that, because I'd never really spend any time with Harry Langdon, and I really got into the character and started to appreciate his stuff. I think Tramp was one I enjoyed as well. I seem to remember. It was excellent. A fantastic article. I've got to say, really, really well worth picking up just on the back of that one alone. Never mind all the other fantastic articles that are in the magazine.
Well, it's an honor to be among the people. I just want to add, there is one person that I left out in the conversation about Komiki, and that's David B. Pearson. So, hey, David, if you're listening, he's important to Komiki because he designed beautifully the entire magazine, which was a ton of work. He created a beautiful product. But he also wrote a really in-depth, fascinating article that's kind of a rebuttal to the famous Walter Kerr book from the 70s, The Silent Clowns. And that's something a lot of us grew up with. We got our kind of first really in-depth understanding of silent comedy from his writings. It was a fairly scholarly, interesting book written from his own perspective. And, David writes about his own experience with the book, countering some of what Kerr's opinions were. That became popular opinion after a while, sort of like, the way the Everson books and McCabe books created a popular opinion of the Fox films or some films that, are kind of questionable, like Be Big or Early to Bed sort of thing. So great work from David on that. And again, I don't have the table of contents in front of me, but lots of great stuff. But kudos to Paul, kudos to David, and kudos to everyone involved in the project. It's an honor to be amongst them.
It sure is.
So what I'd like to do, obviously we're going to talk about Faw Down very shortly, Chris. I want to ask you all about that because that was one of your Atoll films that you kept with you. That was your silent short. So, and I do remember you did say that you would like to come back and talk about that one. So here we are. But before we do, and it's a nice little segue with Harry Langdon and that little link there. Last time we spoke about Harry and his influence on Laurel and Hardy, particularly on Stan, of course. And you and I were in a little bit of a discussion about a certain Larry Semon.
Yes.
And the sort of connections to the boys. And what I do like to try and bring in as much as possible to the Blogcast is a little bit of context and not look at Stan and Babe in a bubble, because obviously they didn't operate in a bubble and we shouldn't look at them in that way either. So if we could just spend a little bit of time looking at Larry Semon.
Or Seaman.
And see what, Or Seaman. Larry, I've said both, haven't I now? Semon or Seaman? Yeah, let's say that's my British nature. I don't want to say Seaman. I shall say salmon.
There's a joke there, but I won't say it.
So yeah, that's what? Thank you, family show. Keep it clean. So what can you tell us about Larry Semon, Chris?
I don't want to get too much into the biography of Larry Semon. If anyone does want to get into, I'm holding up a book that nobody can see. It's called Larry Semon, or Semon, Daredevil Comedian of the Silent Screen by Claudia Sasson. I met Claudia when she started working on this years and years ago and helped her out with a bit of research. It took her a long time to get it out there, but it's the only biography on Larry Semon that's out there right now. And she had an amazing challenge in that Semon died young in 1928. Nobody really talked about him after that. There were a few people who worked with him who survived many, many years later, but he was never really a topic of conversation. So there wasn't really a lot of information post-1928 that Claudia could get on Larry. So she was really dependent on contemporary news reports at the time, but also the opinions of others, which gets back to Walter Kerr, who doesn't speak lovingly about Larry Semon in his book. So that becomes, well, at this point, let's watch the films themselves, because when Kerr wrote the book, a lot weren't available, but thanks to DVD, VHS, YouTube, etc., they became more available, and Claudia did a real job of tracking stuff down. So it's a very knowledgeable book. So in terms of we can touch a little bit on his life story, his biography, but in terms of that, I'd refer people to the book. To me, the interesting thing is that he worked with both Stan and Babe at different times in their careers, and kind of pivotal times, that he, to the point where people, because Stan in his handwritten biography had written down The Rent Collector as one of his films, not his filmography. And there's a Semon film with Babe in it called The Rent Collector, and people were going, "Oh, is that film number 107? Is that a film they're both in?" But it never was. The Rent Collector's out there, and Babe's in it, but Stan isn't. But Semon played a huge role in both of their films. At the time, let's just touch on Stan for a little bit first, which is at the time of that Semon's popularity was growing. It turned out he had started out as a director he was a cartoonist. He became a director at Vitagraph. He directed a lot of stuff with Jimmy Aubrey, who people might know from That's My Wife. Babe was the heavy in Jimmy Aubrey's films that Larry Semon was writing and directing, and then Semon eventually morphed into his own starring series. He went from being just a director-writer to the star of his own one-reel shorts, and again turned out just a ton of them. My favorite title, they were all titles like Frauds and Frenzies, Huns and Hyphens. My favorite is Bathing Beauties and Big Boobs, which again, you can Google that if you want. On YouTube, you'll find it. But it became phenomenally popular over time because the films are actually really, really imaginative and funny. And ultimately, he moved into doing two-reelers, and that's when Stan enters the picture. Not sure exactly how, because Stan up to then had made some of the Hickory Hiram shorts. He had done the 4 or 5 one-reelers per Roach, and then was gone back on the vaudeville stage. And then his next films after that were these 3 films with Larry Semon. And it's interesting to watch the progression. So the first one is called Huns and Hyphens, and lots of German spy, World War I intrigue happening. And Stan is just one of the conspirators in the background. So he's a background player. He gets a few little nice bits, but what I noticed the first time I watched it was how watchable Stan was in the group, right? Like you really, and it's not, I don't think it's just because you know who he is. I think he's just a charismatic fellow that your eye is drawn to, right? So he's doing these small things, and then in the second film, Bears and Bad Men, all of a sudden he has a fairly good supporting role, to the point where he gets involved with a lot of routines with Semon off the top. There's a fishing routine that's a little bit like the one that would show up in Flying Elephants later on. Stan is the recipient of a trademark Larry Semon joke that you see tons of times, which is a duck squirts water in his face. There's always at some point in the Semon film, a chicken or a duck or some kind of woodpecker or something is going to spew a spray of, I guess, water. I don't know what else it would be. I don't know where to get it from, but into somebody's face. Stan gets that. And then he's really involved in a really good chase with Larry, a bear, and Stan kind of running up and down hills and mountains, and Stan ties Larry to a rope sort of thing. And, hilarity ensues. But there's a really nice teamwork there. And I think what happens is Semon gets a lot of discredit as being a selfish, egotistical performer. And I never really find that to be the case. He gives a lot of real estate to Stan in this film. A lot of times, Semon won't show up for the first 5 minutes of his own film, right? So you see this interplay between the two, and that leads to the next logical one, which is the third one, called Frauds and Frenzies, where they're literally a comedy team for 3/4 of the film. They're convicts. They get into shenanigans with picks and shovels and that sort of thing. A little bit Laurel and Hardy. Again, these precursor gags that you see showing up in the Second 100 Years, especially, or the Huskow, that sort of thing. And then they escape from prison, and there's a long series of gags with them where they're fighting over a girl, etc. But there's no question that there's a respectful sharing of each other's talents. That Semon isn't this arrogant, egotistical person. He's someone who's going, this is a fun guy to play with. You can see they're having fun together, right? And to me, it's one of my favorite early Stan Laurel shorts, because it's fun. He's engaged. Semon stuff at this point is super imaginative, lots of fun. But then what happens about 3/4 away from the film, and I think it's where Semon gets his bad rap, is that a chase ensues. and Stan's not part of that. And I think there's a legendary story. I don't know where it originated, but I think it came from a time because, in the 50s or 60s, whenever people, were talking about Semon without really having dealt with them in 40 years or whatever, that apparently there was a pre-screening and Antonio Moreno, who was the romantic lead in The Bohemian Girl, was watching it and said, "Why, this guy's funnier than Semon." At which point Semon cut Stan out for the rest of the film. But I don't really buy that. I think Rob Stone, in his book on the solo films, had a much better explanation, I think, was that the flu epidemic was happening at that time in 1918. And it was pretty severe. It was, not unlike what we just went through for the last 2 years, right? So the studios were closed down. And that's why, not necessarily why Stan was cut from the film, but that's why Stan never worked with Semon again. Because at that point, the studios are closed down. Stan goes, whatever vaudeville gigs he can get at theaters that are open, because the man's got to work, right? But to get back to the chase with Semon, first of all, Stan was very involved in the Bears and Badman's chase. So it's not like Semon wouldn't want him. But I think you just have to compare it to how often did Buster Keaton or Chaplin share his chases with people, right? Like, you don't see, like, even the films with Harold Lloyd and Snub Pollard, at a certain point it becomes a Harold Lloyd film, right? And so I think it's absolutely fair for someone who's shared this, 15 out of 20 minutes of a film with Stan to go, now it's time for a Larry Semon chase, just because that's what people have paid for, right? So, and the chase itself is really funny. Those early films of his are super imaginative.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in terms of Babe Hardy, then because he obviously worked with Babe a number of times. Was there much influence on Babe Hardy's comedy, do you think, from Semon?
It's really hard to say, because you will see. So just to backtrack a little bit, so Semon was directing Jimmy Aubrey films, and Babe was heavy in the Jimmy Aubrey films, and then eventually morphed into becoming Larry's heavy, probably because Larry had more sway there than Jimmy Aubrey did at Vitagraph, more popular performer, and he had his pickings of people he could bring in. You will see some gags. It's funny watching the Semon films more recently. They tend to blur in a little bit. Yeah. So I can't remember everything that happened, but you would see things that do show up, little gags that show up in later Laurel and Hardy films. But I can't really say that Semon influenced Babe's comedy that much. I think one of the things that is maybe a bit disappointing for me with Babe in the Larry Semon films is that he's carrying over something Babe did with the Billy West films, where when he was in the Billy West films, he was doing Eric Campbell. So which was Chaplin's heavy. So Babe's still kind of doing the same thing in the Semon films, where a lot of times he has too much makeup on. He'll have like a big bushy mustache and eyebrows, and he's never really given close-ups. I mean, that is one thing you can say about Semon films. If anyone's going to get a close-up, it's either Semon himself or the leading lady, or if you want, the occasional reaction shot. But Babe doesn't really get a chance to be his best. What you see a lot is big Victorian gestures. I mean, he plays everything big, which is great. If he's going to, chase Semon, he does that kind of revving up, right? He does, before he gets started. Lots of, raising his arms in I'll take care of that guy kind of gesture. But he doesn't get to do the thing that really differentiates Babe later on in his career, which is the facial stuff. Like, the ability to play to the camera, the ability to, show emotion sort of thing. He's not an emotional creature in the Semon films. He's generally just an angry guy.
Yes,
right?
That's right. Yeah, he's just performing a function, isn't he? I guess he's just a heavy, as you say. Yeah.
He's the boss at the sawmill, or he's the boss in the grocery store, or something. And Semon drops a giant vat of jam on his head, kind of thing. But it was certainly. I mean, the interesting thing is I don't have the quote in front of me, unfortunately, but that Babe was very grateful to Semon for everything. Apparently, they became great friends in real life. There's a great picture in Randy's book of the two of them attending the premiere of The Wizard of Oz, where Babe played the Tin Man, and we can touch on that later. Apparently, Semon taught Babe how to golf.
Oh, that's right. Yes, he did, didn't he? Yeah.
Yeah, and so they had a really terrific friendship. And my understanding is that Babe also was an assistant director on some of his films. And I think he gets credit on one called Stop, Look, and Listen. But the film doesn't exist anymore, except for the last reel was found recently. And we can touch on that later as well. Babe's in that as a performer. But, my understanding is he got a chance to direct as well. So Semon put a lot of trust into Babe for somebody who was an arrogant, everything's about me kind of guy, supposedly. And it is interesting as the films progress, as Semon's films progress, Babe's makeup goes away a little bit. Once it gets into the features, like he's in The Perfect Clown, he's in The Wizard of Oz, he's in Stop, Look, and Listen. And he gets a little bit more to do, but just not quite there yet. So I think it's interesting because so many of Semon's films are not only available, but largely available for people to watch right now. Is because they're included on these, cheapy public domain discs, right?
Yeah.
Or the really beautiful ones, like the one that just came out, that the Lobster Films did.
Yeah.
On Blu-ray, where there's a couple of Semon's films on there, and I know that Serge Bromberg had some of those out on previous ones. But it's that seems to be the way most of Semon's films are seen right now, is because of that connection to Laurel and Hardy.
Yeah, it's strange, as you say. He just sort of disappeared, didn't he? His career stuttered and faltered and fell away, and then he was just sort of forgotten about afterwards. So when as his career is sort of on the decline, is around the time when Stan and Babe's or Laurel and Hardy's fame is starting to rise. Is that right? It's sort of coincided in that way.
Yeah, just to kind of quickly touch on it, the kind of fall came, is a little bit of Semon wanting to make bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger films, right? Because his mentality was, and this is stuff that Kerr has talked about. This is true. It's like if one fat man gets a pot of jam on his head, that's funny. But if a fatter fat man gets 2 pots of jam on his head, that's even funnier, right? So he would do things like, apparently he built an entire working sawmill for a 2-reel short called The Sawmill, right? And he would do these, and it just wasn't worth, you watch the film, it's not worth the cost, right? And he would do these amazing, outrageous chases that are really spectacular, but they cost money. So eventually he was working with Vitagraph, that kind of, they said, yeah, no more of that. So he went off on his own and, decided to produce features because, I'm going to be like Chaplin, Lloyd Keaton, etc. And he just wasn't the person for it, right? And we can circle back to that later on if you like. But he found out really quickly he wasn't the person for it. And there's a lot of declining returns. And so by the time you get to late 27, early 28, he's back in 2-reelers. And he's just trying to scrape through at this point. He's doing some work for Paramount. Apparently he either co-directed with Roscoe Arbuckle the Eddie Cantor feature Special Delivery, or he took over. There's another story where the film wasn't working, so Semon took over. And when you see the film itself, especially the chase at the end, there's a lot of Larry Semon in there, right? So it's kind of like that might have been a good direction for him, but he kind of just went on, I'm going to keep producing films. And his very last film, called A Simple Sap, was shot on the Hal Roach lot because he didn't have his own studio at that point anymore. So he had to, kind of scrape whatever he could together. And I don't know if this was at a time, because this would have been, again, late 27, early 28. I don't know if the studio was closed down for the holidays and therefore it was free or whatever. But there's a certain fascination for me in that here was a guy who worked with Laurel and Hardy, and especially for both of them was very instrumental in their careers and their success. Really on his last legs, just as like his star is rapidly descending as theirs is rapidly ascending, right? And you kind of go, I was talking earlier about the conversations with Stan and Buster Keaton. Like, were there conversations, Babe's buddy Larry, hey, good to see you on the lot, because Babe worked with him right until 25. So,
not that long ago. Yeah.
Since they worked together. Right. So what was that thing? Was there an opportunity that, Semon could have joined the Laurel and Hardy gag company, and been, brought a lot of his stuff to the Laurel and Hardy films. So, it's a real shame because he, quite sadly died within the year after the time that film was made. He went on a really grueling vaudeville tour, just to kind of make money because he had been self-producing his films and he lost his shirt, and eventually nervous breakdown, ended up hospitalized for several months and died of tuberculosis. Not unlike Mabel Normand.
Yeah, of course.
The Laurel Hardy story.
Yeah.
So it's a tragic ending, and it must have been hard for him. I say it must have been hard, but was it kind of satisfying to go, wow, these guys are really doing well, that I wish them well, right? Well, but also a little bit melancholy for him to go, oh, brother. Yeah. It's a tough one. Sorry, go ahead, Patrick.
No, I was just mulling that one over. It's it's just really kind of interesting to think, what sort of conversations. I was just going back to what you were saying there. What conversations were they actually having, if any, on the lot? Because we've seen Stan and Babe being very, very generous to people they'd worked with in the past and giving them opportunities and bringing them back into the fold. But there again, would Semon have too much pride? Mm-hmm. To think, well, I'm not going to blow myself to be in the stock company. I'm Larry Semon. You could sort of quite imagine that. And then, of course, you've also got the other side of it where I can't imagine Larry Semon in talkies. That just doesn't seem as if that would have ever taken off. So it would have probably been the final nail in his coffin had he lived any longer than he did. It
might have been. It's hard to say. I think one of the things is that, never having heard his voice, both him and Mabel Normand, there's no recordings I know of their voices, so it's hard to say. I think there's, potentially there might have been room for a cartoonish buffoon like him at some point. I think the problem with early talkies is because they were so static, how do you do the big chases, that sort of thing. But probably you're right. It wouldn't work. I think mostly because his time had come and gone, mostly of his own doing. It's I'm going to touch on, because you kind of have to with him, The Wizard of Oz, which is, it's going to get a bad rap automatically because you compare it to the 39 classic, right? And so even when you see the dollar DVDs, people go, oh, it's going to be like that. And every complaint is like, well, it's not like the movie. Well, it's not, right? I think you have to do a better thing and compare it to like the 1914 films that were done about Wizard of Oz, like His Majesty, the Scarecrow, etc., to kind of go, okay, I get the sensibility of it a little bit closer. But I think the mistake is like only Larry Semon would go, I'm going to make The Wizard of Oz, but the barnyard is more interesting than Oz. Kansas is like, who cares about Oz? Look at in Kansas, we've got big vats of tar you can fall into and that sort of thing, right? You have ducks who can spew milk into your face, that sort of thing. He just had this really challenging time of adapting to feature films. He tried doing, and it gets into something else I want to touch on, just finding himself, because when he's in his shorts, he's just this animated puppet. He's he's funny. He's fun to watch. He moves well. He's goofy and fun, but not a lot of character. It's personality, but not character. After he does The Wizard of Oz, he does a film called The Perfect Clown. He gets someone else to direct it, Fred Neumeier, who directed some Harold Lloyd features. So it becomes a Harold Lloyd film. And the last thing you want to see Larry Semon in is trying to be Harold Lloyd, especially when he doesn't give himself anything to do. It's like here's a series of events where nothing happens, and there's not even a great big chase, right? When he does do a great big chase in his next feature, which is called Stop, Look, and Listen, and that footage was just recently found, it's really just lifting something from a previous film, from the show, the exact same chase, where there's motorcycles and trains, etc. And then that's the exact same chase that's in Special Delivery with Eddie Cantor later on. So there's just nowhere for him to go at this point, which is why, you kind of wish he had recharged, got himself some nice directing and gag writing jobs. Like he did a little bit of that at Senate sort of thing for Alice Day. And you just wish it's like, just stay there, Larry, and chill out and make less money and be happy, right? Because when he goes back to doing his last 4 shorts before he died, which includes a Simple Sap, for some reason he's doing this odd Harry Langdon impersonation, where it's a lot of him kind of standing still and blinking his eyes and big close-ups of that. And again, Langdon had subtlety. He had something behind the eyes. With Semon, he's just kind of like blinking and looking at things, but he'll do these long takes. Like he even does a film like Harry Langdon did a ton of things where there was always mannequins or dummies and he'd get confused with real people.
It makes you wonder what Langdon made of that. He must have seen it and thought, "What the hell? He's stealing my stuff."
I think so, right? Well, especially I think by that point. Well, I think Langdon was still popular by the time those films were being made, because Langdon, like if it would have been made after Langdon's downfall, it would have been. Probably what I just want to wrap up with is saying, as with anyone, as with Harry Langdon, take a look at the films when you can. They're on YouTube, often looking horrible, which is never a good way to see any film. If you have the recent Laurel or Hardy Blu-ray, some really nice looking prints there. Lobster Films put out a nice collection of Larry Semon shorts in France. Previous Kino or Lobster releases, Kino if you're in the US, Lobster if you're in Europe, have put out Laurel and Hardy solo shorts that look nice versus the pound DVDs or dollar DVDs. Track them down. Take a look. Don't do what I did, which is watch them all in a row. But watch one every now and then. I think you'll get a really nice appreciation for the man, better than he deserves, I think. And again, a lot of that goes back to the Walter Kerr and John McCabe writings about Larry Semon versus what might have actually been reality.
Yeah, it does make you kind of appreciate how much of a responsibility we as writers have about putting our own spin on things and sort of dictating people's opinion going forward. It's quite interesting. I've certainly tried to myself step back from putting personal opinions into my essays now. I don't think there's any kind of not so much value in that anymore. No, interesting. And so just sort of circling back now to where are we? Mid-1928, so we're on the Hal Roach lot, and Larry Semon is sort of ending his career there as Stan and Babe are really taking off. It's an interesting time as well at the studio because I'm looking through the trade papers and there's lots of reports. Obviously, we've got the sound era really starting to take off. Certainly at the Hal Roach Studios. I mean, it was obviously taking off a lot earlier in other studios, but Hal Roach is himself is really torn which way to go with sound technology. Stan and Babe now, this is their second film with sound synchronization, Faw Down, and it's just a really interesting time on the lot, I think. So let's get into the episode proper, and we begin as always with our audio blog for today, which is for the film Faw Down. It was filmed August 23rd to September 13th, 1928. It was released on December the 29th, 1928. Produced by Hal Roach, directed by Leo McCary, photographed by George Stevens. As the filming of Habeas Corpus was coming to a close, Hal Roach was still fretting over which way to turn, or perhaps, more accurately, how far to turn, in relation to the new craze for sound pictures. He had determined to move forward and embrace the new technologies, but it was with reluctance and much scepticism. During an interview with the prominent and influential trade paper Motion Picture News, Roach's uncertainty was more than a little evident. Mr. Roach is in New York at the MGM offices for a series of conferences, and the talkie situation is giving him no end of trouble. "I'm just not sure what I'm going to do," said the short comedy producer. "But we will have to have some sound in our comedies. Just how far we will go with it, I don't know yet. I don't see where much dialogue fits into the short comedy, and I doubt if we will inject many lines. But I guess we will at least have to let the movie-going public hear the voices of our comedians, if it's only to have each one of them read a line. Sound and dialogue are all right for the feature picture. I can see where a sound effect here and a few lines of dialogue there might give considerable strength to a long picture, but I'm fearful that it will slow up the short comedy in which speed is one of our main assets. Our main aim is to get in just one more laugh, and the only result I can see if we make comedians stop to talk is a general slowing up of the process. It's a different thing in a short comedy sketch on the stage. There the laughs can be timed. A comedian can wait until the mirth of the audience has subsided, and the longer he has to wait, the funnier his stuff goes over. He can regulate his speed to suit any audience, but it's not yet clear to me how that can be done with the short screen comedy. You might say you can leave certain pauses for your laughs on the screen, but that's impossible. A laugh might last a second, or for minutes. What's going to happen in the midst of these laughs if the comedian bursts into dialogue? The audience is going to be afraid of missing the lines and must stop the laughter abruptly. If this is not done, some of the patrons are going to be annoyed, and once annoyed, it's going to be a more difficult matter to wring laughs out of them. Those are some of the things we're going to have to overcome when we turn to sound in our short comedies. Of course, we will find ways and means of doing it, but it's going to take a lot of patience and a lot of thought. We really had reached a point where the short comedy had arrived, and our sales are about 30% in advance of what they've been in the past at this time of year. We will have to use sound, of course, but I wish it had been delayed a while longer at least. However, you can be sure of this. We will give them the best comedies to be had, whether we employ sound or not. And that was in the Motion Picture News, August 4th, 1928. Despite his apparent uncertainty, the man's usual bullish character emerges in the piece's final paragraph. Mr. Roach may have been entering uncharted territory and feeling something akin to a fish out of water, a sensation possibly unfamiliar to him, having been confidently at the top of his game for many years. However, his determination to be the best was still what drove him on. He would not allow himself to be cowed by uncertainty or new technology. Hal Roach embraced change and was forever looking forward to the next challenge. If he wasn't an expert in a particular field, and he needed to be, he either became one or he employed one. This attitude and approach, and the example he set to all those around him, ensured that the Hal Roach Studios would not falter nor be left behind in the wake of the sound revolution. Unaccustomed as they may have been, they adapted, they learned, and they excelled. For the Laurel and Hardy unit, Habeas Corpus was a very competent first attempt at a sound synchronization. The picture's ghoulish nature lent itself perfectly to a suitably macabre and characterful soundtrack, and for the few thousand theatres equipped to play the score in 1928, it went down a storm. For the boys' follow-up comedy, the studio would employ similar tactics, carefully selecting music tracks from popular and recognisable tunes of the day to fit perfectly with the theme of the on-screen action. Not only was the music suitable, but for those in the audience who knew the songs, the music would become laughter-provoking in its own right. In the same mould as their Purple Moment and Should Married Men Go Home, We Faw Down returned to the theme of Stan and Ollie attempting to escape from their wives to enjoy a bit of playtime. Just as Laurel and Hardy's 1927 short Hats Off was the genesis of their 1932 talkie The Music Box, We Faw Down has the bragging rights of being the inspiration for one of the boys' best-loved feature films, Sons of the Desert. Film historian Glenn Mitchell asserts that the original idea for the picture may have been supplied by Babe Hardy, who had overheard his laundress telling a similar story as gossip. However, William K. Everson asserts that the plot line wasn't an original concept of the Roach team. Everson claims that a Mack Sennett comedy, Ambrose's First Falsehood, released in 1914, starring Max Swain and featuring Edgar Kennedy and Charles Parrott, aka Charlie Chase, has an uncannily similar storyline and likely served as the source of the material. Swain leaves his devoted wife, informing her that he is catching a train to San Francisco. In reality, his intended destination is Kennedy's bar, along with his friend Charles Parrott for company. Later, his wife reads a newspaper report that the San Francisco train she believed her husband to be on had crashed, killing all the passengers. Now, if Kennedy and Parrott's connections weren't proof enough that the story idea could have been generated at the Sennett studio, the film's director was none other than F. Richard Jones. Jones left Sennett in 1921 to become the production supervisor at the Hal Roach Studios. He worked very closely with Stan Laurel and greatly influenced him, coaching Stan on the art of film direction. Jones's story ideas may still have been echoing around the Lot of Fun long after his departure in 1927. In We Faw Down, we find Stan and Ollie desperate to escape their incredibly stern wives, played by Bess Flowers and Vivian Oakland. This was Flowers' first and arguably most notable appearance with the boys, although she does turn up in several films later on, but blink and you'll miss her. But the prize for the sternest wife in this picture easily goes to Mrs. Hardy, played by Vivian Oakland. Oakland first joined the boys on screen playing Stan's wife, Mrs. Ricketts, in 1927's Love 'Em and Weep. Although she's remembered more for her later roles in films such as Scram and Way Out West, she cuts a formidable and frightening figure here, and her frosty glares at Ollie are enough to freeze water. The boys are scheming a way out of the house for an afternoon of poker at their men's club. There are some wonderfully contrasting facial expressions in the first few shots, from the unamused and suspecting wives in one room and the plotting husbands in another. After pretending they've received a telephone call from their boss, a gag that would reappear in Their First Mistake, they inform the wives that they've been requested to attend a work meeting at the Orpheum Theatre. Stan and Babe nervously excuse themselves, engaging in a quick hat mix-up to the background score of Where Did You Get That Hat? They make their way out of the door, hilariously tripping over a small box hedge as they go, and never have two men looked more suspicious. In town, the boys become innocently yet swiftly embroiled with a couple of women played by Vera White and Kay DeLise. DeLise plays the girlfriend of One Round Kelly, a boxer with a face that could stop a clock. Her hat blows off her head and lands under a parked car just as our heroes walk past. But being the gentlemen they are, Stan and Ollie attempt to retrieve the hat, falling flat on their faces in the gutter and getting soaked by a passing street sweeper. Feeling sorry for them, the girls invite them back to their place to dry their clothes. We then cut to the inside of the girls' apartment, and Stan and Ollie and their two new associates are sitting around the table drinking. The boys are wearing dressing gowns, and everybody is getting tipsy. Kay DeLise takes a shine to Stan and starts playfully toying with him. First, she scratches his head, ruffles his hair, and then presses his nose, causing his eyebrow to rise in automatic response. Next, she prods him in the throat, which bizarrely makes his tongue shoot out. This causes DeLise much hilarity, and she now can't stop scratching, pressing, and poking, which upsets Stan more and more. Ollie encourages him, saying he should be bohemian and make whoopee. So Stan finally gives in and tries to enjoy himself, but his naive idea of making whoopee is to shove DeLise physically off her chair multiple times. During this sequence, Richard Courier's sound effects track comes into its own. A sound of scratching accompanies DeLise's assaults on Stan's head. followed by a sort of clockwork noise whenever Stan's nose is pressed or his eyebrows rise. But perhaps the most important, or at least noteworthy effect, however, is the added laughter. The sound of a woman and man laughing accompanies Kay DeLee's and Ollie's laughter, and these are the first human voices ever heard in a Laurel and Hardy picture. And although they may not belong to the actors themselves, the synchronized laughter is highly effective and must have been a wonder to the 1928 audience. So effective are these sequences that it's easy to become lost in the action and forget it's a silent picture. One can imagine the success of this scene providing much needed assurance and inspiration to the Roach technical team and, of course, to Hal Roach himself as to what could be possible with future sound synchronization in their comedies. Meanwhile, as the husbands are hard at play, a fatal disaster occurs unbeknown to the boys. The Orpheum Theatre, the destination used in their cover story, burns down, and the film cuts to some beautiful footage of vintage horse-drawn fire engines charging hell for leather down the street, apparently on its way to the burning theatre. This event naturally makes the newspaper headlines, and the newspaper makes its way into the hands of the waiting wives. Frantic, they run from the house, hoping their husbands are safe. Meanwhile, back at the apartment, DeLee's boyfriend, nicknamed One Round Kelly and played by the terrifying-looking George Kotsonoros, walks in and discovers the two undressed men frolicking around with his girls. He becomes immediately jealous and pulls out an enormous knife. The boys panic and lock themselves in an adjoining room. They quickly start to pull on their clothes, and still in a state of undress, they scramble out of the first-floor window. As bad luck would have it, their wives just happen to be passing at that precise moment, and they witness the half-dressed escapees dropping from the window, assisted by a strange woman. But rather than confronting them there and then, the wives run home and wait for the dirty rats to return. Following their brush with death, Stan and Ollie return home. "Don't forget, we went to the Orpheum," Ollie reminds Stan, followed by another synchronized laugh. The boys are utterly unaware that their cover story has already been blown. Not only had the Orpheum burned down, but worse still, the wives had quite literally spotted them with their trousers down. Once inside, Ollie launches into a description of how great the show was at the Orpheum. But of course, the wives aren't buying it, and Ollie quickly realises there's a problem. The boys try to front it out and stick to their stories, with Ollie attempting to appear incensed that his honesty could be called into question. Intent on putting her husband through the ringer and with murderous looks, Mrs. Hardy forces him to tell them about their afternoon's entertainment. Thoroughly committed to his story, Ollie begins to reenact the fictitious show. Stan positions himself behind the ladies out of their line of vision and grabs the newspaper. He finds the relevant advert for the Orpheum show and tries to mime the various acts on the bill to Ollie in a game of high-stakes charades. There are some funny moments here as Ollie misinterprets Stan's mimes. The Russian and Hawaiian dancing is particularly amusing. Eventually, Stan spots an article detailing the Orpheum's fate, and George Stevens' camera focuses on Stan's reactions. Here we see his glorious double take at the headline and his blank looks as he struggles to process and believe what he's reading. It turns to distress and he begins to cry a little, but then just as quickly stops to reread the headline and try to work it out all over again. This is arguably another example of director Leo McCarey's influence at work. Just as in their purple moment when Stan discovers his cash has been swapped for cigar coupons, the film's pace is slowed to a crawl to allow the audience to savour these wonderful reactions. It's a technique that will be used and relied upon repeatedly in countless films, quickly becoming one of Stan's trademark routines. Finally, Stan holds the newspaper up for Ollie to read the headline, and the game is up. As Ollie tries to find a way to alter his story and smooth things over, the preposterous nature of the whole scene is too much for Stan to bear, and he's unable to stop himself from laughing hysterically, complete with more synchronized laughter. Ollie tries to silence him, understanding how inappropriate laughter and frivolity would be at that moment, but the laughter is infectious and Ollie begins to laugh too. But the final straw comes as the doorbell rings and reveals one of the girls from the apartment returning Ollie's waistcoat, saying, "Here's your vest, big boy." They are immediately chased out of the door by a furious Mrs. Hardy, brandishing a shotgun. The boys flee through an alleyway between two apartment buildings with the wives in hot pursuit. As Mrs. Hardy empties both gun barrels, about a dozen half-dressed, presumably adulterous men leap out of first and second floor windows and run for their lives. This finale gag is terrific, and it's much better than its recreation 10 years later for the finale of the feature-length Blockheads. The scene, shot on location at 2910 West 8th Street in Los Angeles, was recalled with great affection and amusement by director Leo McCarey. One of the funniest things that could ever happen is the funniest thing that happened in my entire life, and I don't see how anything could happen any funnier in anybody's life. It happened when all the men jumped out of the windows. There must have been 5,000 people gathered around to watch us shoot. Before I shot the scene, I didn't want anybody to get hurt, and we had stuntmen jumping from the second floor. Through a megaphone, I explained to everybody we had to get it right the first time. There would only be one take on the account of the danger of the injury. Everybody listened attentively, and I said, "When you jump out of the windows in various states of undress, you run away from the camera and disappear in the alley and back." Everybody said they understood. So came the big moment. I started the camera and called Stan and Babe. They came running in, the wives followed 15 or 20 paces back, and as they were going down between the buildings, the wives fired at them. The men all jumped out of the window, everything's going great, and one foul-up jumped out of the window, pulling on his pants, came running toward the camera and disappeared on the street side right next to the camera. And I bawled him out. I said, "What the hell do you mean by spoiling this scene? Didn't you hear what I said?" The fellow said, "Hell no, I'm not in this picture." Once photography and editing on We Faw Down had concluded, the film was still about 10 minutes too long. To avoid negatively impacting the storyline, the only change the studio could make was to cut several sequences completely. The footage identified came after Stan and Ollie escaped from the girls' apartment. The boys realised that they'd inadvertently put on each other's trousers in their hurry to escape. The scrap sequences consisted of them trying and failing to find a private place to swap trousers. The comedy derived from these situations was so funny, however, that it was not allowed to go to waste. Instead, they built a whole new film around it. The scrapped footage from We Faw Down became part of the first reel of their follow-up picture, Liberty. Arguably, removing the trouser-swapping scenes took away the funniest and most slapstick gags of the entire picture, and what's left, while pleasant enough, lacks pace. Film historian William K. Everson described the picture as, quote, "rather draggy and pedestrian," and it's hard to argue with that synopsis. In agreement, Randy Skretvet stated that it is so slowly paced that the film's musical score provides the only life. But yet, this is still a Laurel and Hardy comedy, and any true fan will find plenty to love about it. Again, one needs to remember the context. Just as we judge Stan and Babe's films against all the rest of their celebrated canon, contemporary audiences evidently compared the boys' latest offerings against all that had come before. The following article, published before We Faw Down's release, provides an interesting example and discusses the difference between the new picture and one that it followed. Quote, "We've just seen a new Laurel Hardy production entitled We Faw Down, and it has started a most interesting argument, one in which you'll be interested. The question is, will it get more laughs from theatre audiences than result from showing Two Tars, its predecessor on the release schedule? We told you at the time we first saw it that Two Tars was the best two-reel comedy ever made. The production department now tells us that We Faw Down, in repeated preview tests in theatres, has scored more laughs than Two Tars. The question is especially interesting from a production point of view. Most comedies are dependent for effects upon mechanical gags. In this sort of production, the differences in results are largely differences in the machinery which is provided for the comedians to work with. Two Tars is a perfect example of this type of production. Automobiles, and what happens to them under a variety of circumstances, furnish the basis of the fun. And the picture, as you should know by this time, is a scream. We Faw Down is entirely lacking in mechanics. The players have absolutely nothing with which to work except what they themselves create. their actions and reactions under varying circumstances, in the main, their facial expressions, are the sole origin of laughs. Obviously, it takes real comedians to put over this sort of production. Was there ever a more sensational rise to stardom than that of America's premier team of short feature comedians, Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy? Class does tell. And that was in the Film Daily, October 5th, 1928. Not surprisingly, following its late December release, We Faw Down was met with very mixed reviews. In the red corner, these reviewers were very positive about the film. Quote, Comiques deluxe. Laurel and Hardy add another fun fest to their long list of laugh inducers. Clever in themselves, this new release sends the guffaw barometer up and up until a high point of hilarity is reached. A silent comedy originally, music and sound have been added. Better with sound, but still a whiz without it. That was in the Film Daily, November 11th, 1928. And the next one is from Motion Picture News, December 1st, 1928. Quote, Here is one of the funniest short comedies ever heard or seen on the screen. It is a Hal Roach offering by MGM featuring Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy, and it is done in sound but no dialogue. Only the laughter of the comedians is recorded, the action is hilarious, and the sound effects ingeniously arranged. The next one comes from the Film Daily, December 12th, 1928. Quote, Genuinely funny. What a funny team Laurel and Hardy continue to be. A synchronized score that is a pip goes with this, embellished with sound effects that enhance the comedy values. Nevertheless excellent in both sound and silent version. Leo McCarey directed and socked the bell midships. And the final one on the positive corner is from the Star Theatre, Wendell, North Carolina, from Exhibitors Herald World, September 21st, 1929. Quote, The best and funniest comedy I have ever seen. If your crowd fails to laugh and go wild over this one, you might as well quit showing comedies. Many thought it worth the whole price of admission alone. And providing balance, over in the blue corner, the following exhibitors were less than impressed. We Faw Down. So does the comedy. From the Texas Theatre, Grand Prairie, Texas. From the Exhibitors Herald World, March 2nd, 1929. I think we expect too much from this great Laurel Hardy team. This one, just so-so. That was the Auditorium Theatre in Laurel, Nebraska. Again from Exhibitors Herald World, March 30th, 1929. Not so good as some of the others. Not as much slapstick. However, it is good. From the Sun Theatre, Kansas City, Missouri, in Exhibitors Herald World, April 13th, 1929. And the last one, according to reports, I expected much of this, but found it a very poor comedy for this pair. And that was the Star Theatre, Moscow Mills, Missouri. Clearly, opinions on We Faw Down were very divided. On this point, it's interesting to note that the picture marked the first time supervising director Leo McCarey officially took the directorial credits on a Laurel Hardy picture. His fingerprints are all over many of the boys' early comedies and are perhaps most apparent in the movies where the pacing is notably slower. McCarey had been hugely influential in Laurel and Hardy's teaming and development. Yet he is also prominently associated with some of the most divisive films in the team's silent era. For example, he claimed to have taken sole responsibility for directing the controversial crotch measuring scene in Putting Pants on Philip, as no other crew member would do it. And he also stepped into the breach to direct the retakes on the highly divisive short, Early to Bed. It seems McCarey did not shy away from being involved with the good, the bad, or the ugly.
Tell me that again. Huh? Let me hear that again.
So, we talked about We Faw Down, and as I mentioned previously, you chose We Faw Down as your silent short of choice for your atoll, which I was really interested to hear about. So, why We Faw Down, Chris? I mean, I'm sure you obviously talked a little bit about it on the previous episode 4, but this is your chance now to put We Faw Down really in the spotlight, and let's see what is it that really floats your boat with this one, Chris.
Well, I think the main thing is, you had talked about personal opinions in in your writing that you're doing right now on the silent films, and I kind of do nothing but opinions on things when I write about things, right? Because it's just like other people are the researchers, like the real researchers, and I'll kind of I'll bring in my thoughts or opinions whenever I'm doing something. But so I think one thing with Laurel and Hardy, and this is something I learned later on, which is see them in an audience, and that's going to make the difference. Because when I was a kid growing up, and this was pre VHS, you would have Super 8 films, and you would watch them in your living room. If they were silent, like We Faw Down, sometimes it would just be projector noise. Sometimes you'd play it at the wrong speed, because you were told that silent speed was different than sound speed. And it was just not any way to kind of appreciate the films. And also, when you read the Everson book, which was kind of the book at the time, but there was also the McCabe band filmography book with all the pictures, but they always had like the 2.5 hats, 3 hats kind of rating, right? So you took those kind of things as gospel. But there's a couple of things I like about We Faw Down. And I think one of the things I like is the way Leo McCarey directs a lot of it, which is it's a little bit unique, and you don't see it in a lot of films. And he does all this kind of like little depth. I call them depth of field. That's probably not the correct technical term, but there'll be a thing where, Babe will be up front in the screen, but Stan will be behind him, kind of slightly out of focus, looking over his shoulder, reacting to what Babe's saying. There's a great shot at the beginning where Babe is sitting on the couch, kind of leaning forward while the wives are playing cards. And then when Babe leans back on the sofa, Stan is revealed, kind of thing. There's a lot of nice touches. And then I think there's also a thing that I like. I just like something about that period of their films where later on they would become fairly sexless, right? Like, and here, there's still, a little bit of that red-blooded male in them, right? Like when they're in the girls' apartment and Babe's going, always going, make whoopee kind of thing, and Stan tries to join in, and then, there's this really nice thing at the end, and where Ollie's trying to explain through pantomime, or he's trying to explain to the wives the vaudeville show they've seen, and Stan is in the background pantomiming, right? What he's pantomiming what was happening on the stage, and Ollie's not quite getting it. And at a certain point, Stan just starts laughing, right? Because it's gotten so absurd, and it's a thing where, like, in retrospect, because you've grown up with the entirety of Laurel and Hardy, you don't kind of, and the later one, you'll go, well, that's kind of out of character for him to laugh at that. It's like that Great Guns thing where, Stan laughs at Babe when he gets the flour sack on his head. But at the time, that's perfectly in character for Stan to do that. And then Ollie starts laughing because he's trying not to, like, he's like getting stern and like squinching up his face. It's like, I'm not going to laugh, but he can't help himself, right? And they just start laughing at the absurdity of it. So there's that nice humanity of it too. But like ultimately the test was, and I mentioned this before, we showed this one year at the Toronto Silent Film Festival. The organizer of that event, Shirley Hughes, gives me an opportunity to book, a matinee of shorts once a year in front of an audience, which is the way to see the films, with live accompaniment. And if you're lucky, you get kids in the audience, right? So you get families and kids versus just nostalgic boomers, which you also get sometimes too. And I've never heard any movie ever in the history of ever get bigger laughs than We Faw Down did with an audience. And I've seen films get huge laughs. Like Arbuckle plays well. Charlie Chase, some of his stuff plays really well. But We Faw Down, people on the street were going, "What's that noise in the theater?" It's just all too rare an occurrence, and it's because it's a very subtle film. And I think, to get back to Larry Semon, I've shown Larry Semon stuff at the Toronto Silent Film Festival, and it doesn't work that well. Other people have had results where it has. Oh, this is a real winner with audiences. But I find that if the performers have personality or character, that's going to get bigger laughs than the big slapsticks. So, Larry Semon could die on screen, but, Laurel and Hardy just doing this little pantomime thing they do at the end with, Stan trying to show that, there are bicyclists on the stage, and Dave thinking that they did card tricks. That got like enormous laughs in comparison. So right away, you go, my belief in this film is vindicated, right? That's a film that I always thought was a little sideways, fairly interesting, but then to just have 300 people in a room agree with you to that extent is a nice feeling. The interplay is there. I'm going to read you something, and you can decide whether you want to keep this or not. But this is an article I found some time ago. I can't tell you the source of it because I don't have which newspaper it came from. But I want to read this kind of verbatim, if I may. May I?
Is this? And I think I know which one this is. This about Tutors?
Yeah.
As well, yeah. It's the Film Daily, October 5th, 1928. But do carry on.
Okay.
I'd love to hear you.
You've read it already, but for your listeners who haven't, yes. The Film Daily in October 1928 headline: "Which comedy is funnier, Two Tars or We Faw Down? Discussion of relative laugh values involves some interesting facts. New product, which would be We Faw Down, contains no mechanical gags." So here's the article. "We've just seen a new Laurel Hardy production entitled We Faw Down, and it has started a most interesting argument, one in which you'll be interested in. The question is, will it get more laughs from theater audiences than result from showing Two Tars, its predecessor, on the release schedule? We told you at the time we first saw it that Two Tars was the best two-reel comedy ever made. The production department now tells us that We Faw Down, in repeated preview tests in theaters, has scored more laughs than Two Tars. The question is especially interesting from a production point of view. Most comedies are dependent for effects upon mechanical gags. In this sort of production, the differences in result are largely differences in the machinery which is provided for the comedians to work with. Two Tars is a perfect example of this type of production. Automobiles and what happens to them under a variety of circumstances furnish the basis of the fun. And the picture, as you should know by this time, is a screen, which it is. We Faw Down is entirely lacking in mechanics. The players have absolutely nothing with which to work except what they themselves create. Their actions and reactions under varying circumstances is the main. Their facial expressions are in the sole origin of laughs. Obviously, it takes real comedians to put over this sort of production, and you'll find most of them on our lot." So that's obviously a Hal Roach production piece. But yeah, it's a little publicity from Hal Roach. But what is interesting is it really kind of sums up Laurel and Hardy. And I've written about this before, which is the players have absolutely nothing to work with except what they themselves create. Their actions and reactions, their facial expressions are the origin of laughs. And that's, ultimately what it is with Laurel and Hardy. And I think with We Faw Down, they're in this perfect zone of just, subtle reaction, nothing big, returning gags like the poking the nose and the eyebrow arching. And Stan repeating that later on with his own wife and just getting a little kick out of it while she's confused. There's a
Yes.
playfulness. There's a lot of great stuff happening. I know you've been talking a lot about the music too. This being, their second sound film. I don't know how much you got into it with previous people, but the score on this is really interesting too because. It's an example of what you would call, I guess, Mickey Mousing, it came to be known, which is just using popular music of the time to establish what's happening in the film. So Laurel and Hardy's opening theme for a long time was "That's My Weakness Now" in those original silents or the original sound on disc films. then so that becomes kind of a theme, which works well because the girls are their weakness. But then, there's also the use. There's a song called "What'll I Do." Which, whenever they're kind of in trouble, especially when Babe's in trouble later on, that comes in just like, uh-oh, I'm in trouble. So really nice use of popular music throughout. And also just in terms of popular records that were used, there's that really nice laughing sequence in the middle, which is, I think their second one after Leave 'Em Laughing. But this time, if you get a chance to see it with the original score, which not all copies have it, but if you see it with the original score, it actually lifts from a record from around 1922 called the OK Laughing record, which was just this record where contagious laughter is being played. And I guess if you were at home and you had party guests over or something, you would play that and just listen to it. It was a novelty, and you would start, laughter is literally what's laughter is contagious, and you just start laughing at it. So it's interesting to see them take that use of that record and apply it to something they've already established and Leave Them Laughing and go, how can we elevate that through sound? So it's a little bit experimental that way. And then also, they bring it back later on when I talk about, Stan starting to laugh when, it gets so absurd. They bring back a little of that too, right?
And also, there is another piece of music in there, which is "Where Did You Get That Hat?"
Yeah.
When the boys are just leaving the apartment and they're doing the hat swapping routine.
Yeah, I think they used that a lot in Wrong Again too. So it's got a lot of interesting, subtle stuff happening throughout the film. That's really them at the top of their game in their period, and it's a really tight film too. It's interesting in that was supposedly supposed to have the High and Dizzy stuff from Liberty in it.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if it's. I'm trying to think now. It certainly it picked up where the boys are escaping from the apartment and they've got each other's trousers on. So there was a lot of where they're hiding behind that lift, and the policeman spots them, and then they go into the alleyway, and that crab falls into the trousers. I'm not sure if the High and Dizzy stuff was actually part of that film. I think that was the stuff they added later. I might be wrong with that, but I'm pretty sure the High and Dizzy stuff was what they they added on to make.
You know what? I think you're absolutely correct. They shot all this great footage, and then it's like, okay, we got so much footage that we'll make another film around it. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I think you can see there's there's a dissolve in We Faw Down or something that you can, if you actually think about it, you can see, okay, this is where this was cut, right? So I take that back. I was talking about the Hind Dizzy, but it's not there. Or it wasn't intended for there anyway.
But the link with Liberty is certainly there, because I think when they took it to preview screenings, it was about 10 minutes too long, and they had to cut 10 minutes worth of footage out, and the only way to do it without impacting on the actual storyline was to take out the trouser swapping part, which arguably took away a lot of the funniest parts of We Faw Down, as I would see it anyway. There's certainly a lot of the more slapstick in nature stuff.
Yeah. Well, there's stuff I do when I'm doing like my own work. If I'm writing things, which is called like shaking the tree, right? Which is just like you shake the tree, and the apples that stay in the tree you keep, and the other ones you don't, right? And I think Laurel and Hardy were actually really good at that. To go, okay, this doesn't. Things like the extended version of Pardon Us doesn't work so well for me, right? It's a troublesome film to begin with, the way it was made. There's like how many different versions out there if you include the Spanish version, and it's like they're put together like I've just got squares and we're going to put together in these orders. Like the Spanish version is the same running time as the English language version, but a completely different film, right?
Yeah.
But for the most part, they knew how to keep it tight and not have extraneous stuff. And even when they do, like let's say, Be Big. Like Big is one that a lot of people go, it goes on too long. I think it would play really well in front of an audience personally, but it's focused on one thing, right? Like the entire film is, okay, it's all going to be about putting a boot on and taking it off, right?
Let's get together. There's nothing to getting a boot off. You don't have to drag me around the room. It's most embarrassing. Let's concentrate and use our brains. Rome wasn't built in a day. Remember the old adage? A task slowly done is surely done. Do you understand?
Sure. A cool head never won fair lady.
Now just follow my plan and see how easy, how simple, how free from care everything will be.
Whereas with We Faw Down, it's the setup, then it's the girl's apartment, and then it's this whole thing with the crab in the pants potentially, and then it's back to the home with the wives and explaining. It's just like it's one note too many, right? It's just like set up with the wives, trouble with the girls, back to the wives, and it's just a much tighter thing. I think even in the Sons of the Desert script, there was supposed to be a lot of stuff at the convention that went on with bicycles in the parade and things like that. And it might have been shot or it might have not been shot, but it's just a thing. It's like, it's not necessary. The convention is here to show that they're having a good time. They meet Charlie Chase. That's the plot pivot there, right? Or that leads to something, and now let's get out of it, right? So they could keep kind of true to the story. So,
yeah, I think that's a good point. I was just going to say, I think it's just around that time, talking about mechanical gags, it looks as though they kind of, as they're going along through this silent period, they're sort of learning that they don't need all this mechanical gags, or because eventually you're going to run out of things to work with because you've already done it before. So, yeah. And the beauty of what Stan and Babe do is that they can just be funny themselves.
Yeah.
Just those two, or those two with another person, and that's why they lasted so long, isn't it? Because they could just keep on going.
Yeah. Well, ask Larry Semon about that, right? Like Larry Semon was largely about mechanical gags, and it's like once you've done the motorcycle avoiding the train, once. How do you do it differently the second time? He kind of opted not to do it differently the next time, right? Once somebody climbs up a giant water tower that somebody puts dynamite at the bottom so it can explode and they can swing off a rope from the giant water tower as it tumbles, It's like there's no there, right? Whereas, Stan and Babe can do a film like, Wrong Again, which has, a ludicrous premise, but believable. But then it's just the two of them and the horse. I mean, that's always the amazing thing about Laurel and Hardy is they can do an entire film with just the two of them, right? And they don't need all that other stuff, right? Sometimes great. Two Tars is a great film. It still kind of stems from their personality, right? It's more personality driven. There's a purpose behind all the destruction. But then, a film like Busybodies later on, where, Charlie Hall's in there for a minute, Tiny Sanford shows up, but for the most part, it's just them puttering around with the thing, right? And Stan not even talking. I think I got a counter out. I think Stan says 6 words in the entire film, right?
Yeah, but it does, yeah.
But their reliance on themselves. Somebody asked me, who the most important supporting player was in Laurel and Hardy films. I kind of went through this whole litany, and at a certain point, I was going, all right, let's think sideways. It's not Jimmy Finlayson, blah, blah, blah. And I went, maybe it's Laughing Gravy, right? Because I was going, because Laughing Gravy, compared to the similar film Angora Love with a Goat, Laughing Gravy brought in this dimension of you can have more emotion and more real love for the dog, which seems truer to Laurel and Hardy than you do with a goat, right? And then I was going, okay, well, not Laughing Gravy. And then I went, okay, well, maybe it's Leroy Shields' music, right? I went, oh, that's an interesting thing. So I pursued that a little bit. But then ultimately, I ended up writing this piece. I haven't put it anywhere yet. But it's like the most important supporting players are Babe supporting Stan and Stan supporting Babe, right?
Yeah, absolutely right.
And that's all you need. And even in the later films, when Finlayson and Charlie Hall and everyone else is gone and they're at Fox, they have each other still, right? Which is something Buster Keaton didn't have, right? When Buster Keaton went to MGM, he didn't have that, but they still had each other. So, again, that's the beauty of a film like We Faw Down is the interplay, and that beauty of when they're laughing together because they've been caught and they can't help it. And it's just like, we give up, And then also, We Faw Down has the best ending of any Laurel and Hardy film.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
Because it's surprising. It's got that pre-code sensibility to it.
That's right.
And that's why it doesn't work in Blockheads. Because
I agree with that. Yeah.
It works in We Faw Down because these guys have no pants. And we've just established this thing of guys in no pants in a girl's apartment, right? We know what's going on, right? In Blockheads, it's just like a bunch of clothed men jumping out of windows for some reason, right? And that's because it's post-code. But, again, just the reaction, the audience reaction to that ending was spectacular. And what a way to end a film.
Yeah. Have you seen the Leo McCarey quote about that from an interview with Peter Bogdanovich? And Leo McCarey was saying that it was the funniest thing that ever happened that he could ever think of happening was that when they shot this finale, and they said they were only ever going to do it once because you got guys jumping out of first, second, third floor windows and what have you. Mm-hmm. So we got everybody primed and ready. He says when everybody jumps out, you all run off away from the camera and disappear into the alley in the back. And so they called action. Stan and Babe run through, followed by the wives. When the gunshots go off, all these guys jump out, and one guy, one screw up I think he called him, runs towards the camera and disappears off right past the camera off at the front. So McCarey shouts at him and says, "Didn't you listen to what I said?" He says, "I'm not in this film." So he was obviously I think that is just I think it's just that's got to just be a story. It's got to be a really good story.
I hope that's a true story. That's funny. I hadn't heard that.
It's a good one, isn't it?
That's funny.
No, it's a really good one.
I'll have to look for that guy because I think there is a guy who runs towards the camera.
There's actually two guys that run towards the camera, which makes me wonder if it was just a funny story that McCary. If it had been just one guy, I think that would have perhaps stood up a little bit more. But I mean, who am I to question the great Leo McCary? I don't know.
Maybe this was the one guy that Leo McCary caught. The other guy kept.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, but I think Los Angeles must be full of adulterous men in apartment buildings in every corner. You fire a gun and they'll fly out of a window.
Well, you watch any Charlie Chase short from that time, and that's all it is adulterous men.
Somebody's coming to my house. Somebody's coming to stay. Father feels so happy, he's jumping with joy. All he keeps saying is, I hope it's a boy. Mother is waiting, the stranger. Oh, come to brighten my life. I can hear Mother say, if you'll pardon me a minute, I'll come round.
No, it's an interesting film. I do think We Fall Down it suffers with pace a little bit, and I know Everson, I think, mentioned the same, and I think Randy Scratford also touched on something very similar. I think if it had the pants swapping routine in, it would have been better, arguably. But it's certainly a Leo McCary short. You can tell that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to disagree with everyone on that. I think the pacing on it is just fine.
Yeah, well, that's great. I mean, this is what I love about films. You know, they are very subjective, and what one person thinks is not so good. And in fact, with We Fall Down, it was received with very, very mixed reviews. You know, if you go through all the trade papers, which I have done, there's so many people think it's fantastic, the best comedy we've ever seen, and then some people think, yeah, it's not very good. This one, it's just so, or you know, it's fascinating, really.
But do you see that a lot?
Right down the middle.
Do you see that a lot? Do you see things where people go, two tars with a failure?
No, not really. Okay. Generally speaking, from what I've found, the only times that happens is on the films that we know are divisive. So Early to Bed for one. You know, Otherwise, they seem pretty standard. You know that. These are the best thing ever, you know. I mean, it's interesting to see as we progress, and I'm waiting for a point where, because at the moment they're still quite new and fresh, you know, with the public in late 28. So I'm just sort of waiting to see if that rise starts to peak, and whether or not it will sort of tail off a little bit. So I'm sure it will do eventually as we get into the features and so on. But at the moment they're riding the crest of a wave, and it's very, very interesting. There are some excellent reviews for We Fall Down, but I like one of the reviews from the Texas Theatre. We Fall Down, so does the comedy. That's it. That's the whole review.
Slam.
Brilliant, Chris. Thank you so much for spending this time with us again today. And yet again, it's been an education for me on Larry Semon this time. So I'm much more up to speed on Langdon and Semon, or Seaman. I've got to get this right one of these days. But no, thanks ever so much for coming on. It's been a joy as always, and hopefully we'll come and we'll see you again at some point.
All right, thank you, Patrick, and I'll think of some other divisive comedian to talk about next time.
That's it, yeah. All the best, Chris. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Well, that's enough high living for me for this episode, and I'm now off to take my trailer up into the high multitudes for a week. I hope you've enjoyed the show. Please do send in your feedback any way that you can, whether Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or good old-fashioned email. You can reach me at laurelandhardyblog@gmail.com. That's Laurel and A-N-D hardyblog@gmail.com. Coming up next time in episode 26, we'll be getting high and dizzy as we review the boys' brilliant short, Liberty. So before then, you might want to familiarise yourself with that one. Huge thanks to my wonderful guest, Chris Seguin. Thank you to all at the Bohunks Orchestra and Basta Music. And don't forget, you can find links to purchase CDs of their music in the show notes and on the Laurel and Hardy blog website as well. And 1,000 thanks finally to you for listening once more. And until next time, it's goodbye from him.
Goodbye.
Goodbye from him.
Goodbye.
And it's a very goodbye from me. Goodbye.